Masechet Yevamot Daf Nun Gimel. We plan to complete the fifth perek today. One quick follow-up to the interesting law we saw yesterday about a problem for son-in-laws living in the house of their fathers-in-law. Our Gemara is actually a little piece of a longer quote that's found in Masechet Baba Batra. In Baba Batra is quoted as a citation from the book of Ben Sirah. And in that version is longer and very interesting. It says, I weighed everything in scales and found nothing lighter than bran. But lighter than bran is the son-in-law who lives in the house of his father-in-law. So I guess lighter meaning lighter morally. I mean, in terms of weight, bran is the lightest thing. But there's nothing... so nothing lighter than bran, but there is something lighter than bran in terms of its quality of action. Even less qualified, less moral than that is sleeping in a father's house. And lighter even than a son-in-law who lives in a father's house is a guest who invites another guest. And lighter than even that is someone who answers a question before he even hears the question. He that gives an answer before he hears it is folly and full of confusion. Okay, so that's just fantastic to see the poetic quality of this, that each phrase follows up on the other. You think this is the worst? No, there's something even worse. So number one consolation that son-in-laws living in their father-in-law's houses is only the third to worst thing that someone can do. But also a follow-up that Tosafot says, we all do it, so we have to justify this. And actually, if you look carefully, Tosafot points out, Rav, in the conclusion of the Gemara, is that Rav did not give lashes to people who did this, only to one of the other categories. In any case, people are only doing it because of Tovat Hana'ah, because they get to stay for free somewhere. And so we don't have to worry that they have any thoughts that are any worse than just getting some free place to stay. And so therefore, this has been followed in the breach since the times of the Rishonim. And that was just a fun follow-up for that Talmud. Okay, now back to the Gemara. At the end of the daf yesterday, we saw a baraita with a machloket regarding hacholetz livim tov v'chaza v'kiddusha. You did chalitza and then kiddushin after the chalitza. So we saw that our Mishnah, the opening Mishnah of this perek, mentioned that after chalitza there is nothing else. Once you do chalitza, if he tries to remarry her in any way, ma'amad or kiddushin, whatever, it does not work and is no validity. It does not have to do anything afterwards. And then we said that fits the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who says even in Isur Lav, and marrying a chalutza is prohibited only by an Isur Lav. Rabbi Akiva says in Isur Lav, Kiddushin does not take effect. So that would make sense according to Rabbi Akiva. But actually that's a minority opinion. And there are here two other opinions. Rabbi says, if you did Kiddushin as Ishut, then that is valid and you need a get. Because even though it's Isur Lav, if one does do a regular marriage, it works. But if he gave kiddushin as for yibum, right, and said here arehat mikudeshet li b'ma'amad yevamin, then he already did chalitza. There's no more zikah here to take hold of. You're out of the picture, so you can no longer do that type of ma'amad. Actually, there are 6 explanations for this. We saw 3 of them so far. That was one of them. And then Chachamim said that it doesn't matter. Even if, as long as you do Kiddushin, whether you say it with the language of Yishut, whether you use a language of Yevamot, it is valid and requires get. So we're trying to explain the difference between these two opinions. And so we saw 3 explanations already. And now we're going to see a 4th one by Rav Sherevya Amar Bachalisa Keshera Id Amar Lahit Kadshi Li Bezikat Yevamin Kule Ama Lo Peligi de Lo Mahane. So he's responding to the one before, and he says that it doesn't matter if the language is the response before said. If you use a language of Zikat Yevamin, then that makes a difference because their machloket is there zikah or is there no zikah, and so Rabbi who says yesh zikah, so it only works when there is a zikah, when the chalitza comes and undoes the zikah, now you can no longer do that. Rabbanan said, en zikah. So even before he did chalitza, he thinks zikah is not something substantial. So if this formula works before chalitza, then it also works after chalitza. Okay, that was that. He says, no, there's no difference. They're not arguing about that. They're actually arguing on the topic of chalitza pesula. That means it's not totally invalid chalitza. It means a deficient chalitza, assuming here that the case is, the Braita doesn't say this, but he's assuming that the Braita is talking about a case where, let's say he gave a get first, and then chalitza. When you give a get first, then you can no longer do yibum. So, in any case where you could have done yibum, and you do chalitza, that's a full chalitza. But in any case where you could not have done yibum and you do chalitza, that chalitza is deficient, is not as powerful. And this is what they're arguing about. Mor sabar chalitza pesula poteret, mor sabar chalitza pesula ena poteret. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi thinks that a deficient chalitza is powerful enough and totally dissolves the zikah, even though it's deficient, he doesn't care. And therefore, in this case where he gave a get first, and then chalitza, deficient, but that's okay. We consider it full. And since there's no zikah anymore, if he tries to do a ma'amad, a kiddushin, with a language of chalitza, it does not work because there's no zikah there for it to take hold of. Umor Savad, the rabbis say, chalitza pesula ena poteret. They say in general that this type of deficient chalitza does not fully break the zikah. For example, maybe the other brothers would still have to do chalitza, or maybe he would have to still do chalitza with a co-wife. So there's still some amount of zikah there, because there is some zikah there when he does after get, and then after chalitza, when he does ma'amad, even if he uses the language of chalitza, it is effective, because there's some remnant of zikah there still. All right, that's the fourth answer. Fifth. Rav Ashi amar dekol ha'ama chalitza pesula ena poter. Rav Ashi says, no, everyone can agree that this type of deficient chalitza does not fully break it, and there's some zikah left. But we're talking about something else. More sabar yesh tenai b'chalisa, or more sabar and tenai b'chalisa. What they're arguing about is a case where you make a condition. Again, the Braita doesn't say this, but we're making an okimta. Could be he's talking about such a case where he does kiddushin and he says, you are mikudeshet to me on condition, and you can make any condition, regarding when it comes to regular kiddushin, gitin also, a regular kiddushin, you can make any condition on it. You can say, I'll agree to marry you if it rains tomorrow. I'll agree to marry you if, Rashi says the example, if you give me 200 zuz. If you give it 200 zuz, then it works, otherwise not. Now, everyone is in agreement that you can make a tanai in regular kiddushin. And so that's why in the case where he does harer mikodesh eli with ishut, the B agrees with Chachamim that is valid, and he would have to give a get afterwards. The question is, the machloket is there tanai in chalitza? Right? Let's say the Yavam gives the Yevamah, he does chalitza, he says, listen, this chalitza is going to be on condition that you pay me $50,000. And then if you don't pay, then it's not a chalitza. So there's a machloket about that. Yesh tenai b'chalitza. So that's the sages, Rabbanan, say that a condition is effective regarding chalitza. And therefore it makes no difference whether you'd use the language of ishut or the language of chalitza. In both cases, let's assume it's where he made a condition regarding the chalitza. And he said, this will only be on condition that the chalitza will be broken on condition that you give me 200 zuz. And she doesn't pay the 200 zuz. So according to Rabbanan, the chalitza was never effective. And therefore, when he does the kiddushin, so the kiddushin will be effective. Because the zikah is still there, and so even if you use the language of yibum, it will take effect because he used there was never a chalitza. The chalitza was on condition. However, mor sabat and tenai b'chalitza, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says that conditions are ineffective regarding. We make believe the condition isn't there. So if you say I'm doing this chalitza on condition that you pay me 200 zuz, we forget the condition, and we say the chalitza is simply valid, even if it's never paid. And therefore, in this case, we consider the chalitza a chalitza, even if it's pisula, it doesn't make a difference. And therefore, the zikah is broken. So if he uses a language of kiddushin for yibum, there's no zikah for it to take effect on, and therefore we throw it out. If you use language of kiddushin, then it is effective, because even if there is a full chalitza, nevertheless, according to everyone but Rabbi Akiva, the kiddushin works after regular kiddushin works after chalitza. And the last explanation is similar. Ravina says everyone agrees that putting a condition is effective regarding chalitza. Havacha betanai kaful kamipalge. What they're arguing is, what kind of condition is effective? Do you need a double condition? So for certain matters, you need to make a condition like the sons of Reuven and Gad did when they made a deal with Moshe. And Moshe told them, listen, if you go into the land and fight with us, then you can get this area on the other side of the Jordan. If you don't, then you will not be able to. You have to say it in a positive and in a negative. And the question is, do you have to formulate it in that way? So Mor Savar, Ba'inan Tenai Kafur. Biuda Nasi says, in order for it to be a proper condition, you have to say it in a double way. And let's assume this is a case where you didn't say it in a double, in a positive and a negative. So, according to the Biuda Nasi, because you didn't formulate it correctly, the Tanai in the kiddushin, in the chalitza, and the chalitza and the Tanai is effective, and you didn't do it in the right way. Therefore, we ignore whatever condition you tried to say, and the chalitza is simply fully effective. So because the chalitza is fully effective, there is no zikah anymore. That's why, according to the B, if you use language of vishut, that works, because that works in any case of a lav. But if you use the language of ma'amad, of yevamin, there's no zikah anymore for it to work on, and that's why he believes in this case it's not valid. The kiddushin is not valid. Whereas the Rabbanan say lo ba'inan tenai mosava lo ba'inan tenai kaful. You don't need a compound condition. So he made a simple condition, only if you do this, without the if not. And the condition still applies, and assuming she did not fulfill the condition, so the condition applies, and it cancels the chalitza. So there never was a chalitza to begin with. That's why the zikah remains. Because the zikah remains, that is why the kiddushin is valid and will require a get after it. Okay. Some of these seem like somewhat far-fetched types of scenarios, and some of them, of the assumptions that we said in the meantime, are actually against the majority opinion, against the halakha, which is really curious. And the Rif, he has a wonderful formulation here. He says, "V'kuluhu ta'ameh di'itmeru behai peluktad Rabbi ve'Rabbanan." He says all of the explanations, these 6 explanations that were said to explain the difference of opinion between the Rabbi and Rabbanan, lo semchinan alayhu, we do not rely on them for halakha. Delav alibad hilchataninu, they were not said as that they should be taken seriously, practically as halakha. Ela ukimta ba'almaninhu, they are simply suppositions. They are simply presumptions that it could be talking about this possible case. So more as a theoretical exercise of how many different ways can we figure out to explain, bringing in lots of other machalokot that we do find in other cases, and how can we relate this machloket to those machalokot. So this is a very important mental exercise to relate various aspects of the halakha one to another, but should not be analyzed as halakha lema'aseh. The next section asks a stylistic question of the Mishnah. Chalatz ve'asa ma'amar v'natan get u'ba'al v'chule v'netne name en achar bi'ah kelum. If we go back to the Mishnah, I mentioned the case where someone first does chalitza, one yevama, and then after he does chalitza to this one woman, then he does a ma'amar, or gives a get, or bi'ah. All of these things are ineffective. The bi'ah would be prohibited, but the point is it's ineffective in creating any new zikah. And then it says, or if he did bi'ah first, and after he did bi'ah, good, then that's yibum. Now they're married. Afterwards he does ma'amad, or he gives a get, or halatz, that also will not affect the zikah. right? Certainly, ma'amad, there's no point in getting engaged after they're already married. And the chalitza will not be effective, because that's it, you did bi'ah. The get will end the marriage, because they're married and you could give a get. But the point is, it does not do anything further to the zikah, to any other brothers, to any other co-wives. So these are all ineffective in terms of the zikah. And then the Mishnah continues, says, En achad chalitza kilum, a general rule, there is nothing after chalitza. Well, it should have said, and there's also nothing after bi'ah. Why does it only talk about chalitza if actually the last thing it mentioned was bi'ah, or say both? That's the question. Why not say also after bi'ah there is nothing? And the answer is, so they both, Ravan, Abaye and Rava, they agree on some things, and they say, yes, you should insert into the Mishnah the words, and there was also after bi'ah there is nothing. It's not clear if they're amending the Mishnah and saying I have to change it, or it says, yeah, it means it. It didn't have to say everything, but yeah, of course it means it. Now, V'tana Didan, question. Our memorizer who recited in this way, why didn't they include this phrase if in fact it is true? And the answer is, Hatarat Yevama Lashuk Adif Aleh. They prefer to talk about the case where the Yevama goes and is free to marry anyone in the marketplace. That's the better case to emphasize, especially in these kind of complicated cases where the guy can't make up his mind. He does bi'ah first, and then he does ma'amad, then he does chalitza. So if you're gonna have a complicated case, then the best, easiest, safest thing is do chalitza. She goes free. And then she won't have to worry about the other brothers, the other co-wives, or anything else. So this is the best option. Although you're right, after bi'ah, technically they are married, and then there's nothing that would change the zikah status after that. All right, the next phrase says echad yevama achat ve'echad shete yevamot. That all these principles that we applied makes no difference if it's one yevama or two yevamot. Meaning one Yevama and two brothers, or two Yevamot and one brother, and who each do one activity and the other does some other activity. Okay, Matnitin de loke Ben Azai. This Mishnah does not agree with Ben Azai. We mentioned him previously. Tanya Ben Azai Omer Yesh Ma'amad Achad Ma'amad B'Shnei Yevamin V'Yevama Achat Ve'en Ma'amad Achad Ma'amad B'Shnei Yevamot V'Yevam Echad. Ben Azai does make a distinction between them, so he wouldn't agree with this phrase, because he says that if you do Ma'amad after a Ma'amad, that is effective, so he would agree with the Mishnah if it was a case of two brothers with one Yevama, because in that case, each of the two brothers has a zikah, right? Until one does Yibum or Chalitza, both of them have the option of doing Yibum or Yibum or Chalitza. So now when one brother does Ma'amad not so effective, so the other one still has his own power, his own zikah, and therefore if he does Ma'amad, both of them will be effective. So in that case, yes, he agrees. But if there's only one Yavam, then he has only one power to do Kiddushin, or to do Yibum. And therefore, if he elects and does it with one Yevama, he spent all of his energy, right? Whatever energy he had that goes into a Ma'amad. And that's it. He's indicated he's going to go forward with this one. And therefore, the second one is not going to add any more to that. He has no more of that type of energy to do a ma'amad to the second wife. And so therefore, he does make a distinction. And that's probably why the Mishnah has to go out of its way to emphasize 2-3 times that it doesn't matter. You could do it this way or that way. It doesn't matter if it's 2 and 1 or 1 and 2, because this is the opposite of Ben Azai's opinion. We now move on to one of the next phrases in the Mishnah of Kesad Ma'amad Lazo. This is here when there are 2 Yevamot. And we had Kesad, and the last one of that set was Ma'amad Bazo. It does Ma'amad with one of the kawais, and then Chalitza with the other. So even though Chalitza breaks the Zikah with the second co-wife, nevertheless he has to give a get to the first co-wife in order to undo that Ma'amad. So Gemara is going to notice it's interesting that he does Chalitza with the second and not with the first. How come it doesn't say he does Ma'amad with the first? And how about if he did Chalitza with the first? And it sounds like that would not be good for the second. So based on that inference, we say, Lema Messiah Shmuel, perhaps this Mishnah supports the opinion of Shmuel. Damar Shmuel, Chalatza Ba'alat Ma'amad, Lo Niftera Sarata. That if in fact he had the first co-wife, he did Ma'amad too, and then Chalitza with that same first co-wife, the second co-wife would not be able to go free. The reason is because this is a deficient chalitza. Since he did ma'amad with her, he's going to be required to give a get to the same one. And giving a get means you're breaking the zikah somewhat, and therefore that chalitza is deficient and not as strong enough to release the second co-wife with whom he did not do any ma'amad. And so, because this Mishnah says he did a get to one, he did ma'amad to one, and chalitza to the second, it sounds like that's on purpose, has to be the second, and then both are freed. But if they did it to the first, then the second one would require her own chalitza. So this seems to support Shemuel. Furthermore, it seems to reject Rav Yosef. It's Yuvta de Rav Yosef. It doesn't cite here what Rav Yosef said, but Rav Yosef said earlier that if you have a Yavam, and before him are two Yevamot, one who is prohibited to a Kohen already, maybe she was already divorced, or if this Yavam himself did Ma'amad or get with her, and there's another co-wife who is permitted to a Kohen, then it's preferable to do Chalitza to the one who's prohibited to a Kohen, so that she will not be any further limited, rather than take someone who can marry a Kohen and make her not able to marry a Kohen. So you see, according to Rav Yosef, it works if you do, if you have give a ma'amad or get to one woman, and then give her chalitza. That works for the second co-wife, because that's what he said. You should always give it to the one who is already prohibited. And our Mishnah seems to reject that, because our Mishnah gives an example of a case where he did ma'amad to one and chalitza to the other. So we reject this. Both the proof for Shemuel and the challenge to Rav Yosef are rejected. Mikatani holes, halas katani diavad. Doesn't say that he goes and does it as if he should do it, but rather it's in past tense. He did it, but diavad. Now he went and did that. But we would not advise him to do that, to do such a thing in the first place. So it just happens to be the case. So it's bringing all cases, and happens to be he gave it to the second one. But it doesn't mean that if he gave it to the same one, that it would not be effective for the other co-wife. Okay, good. Now one of the next lines is get lazo ve get lazo. Here we go. If he gave the last one, the first one, the next line, get lazo and get lazo, he gave get to both of them. So it says sirichot hemenu chalisa. Sirichot in plural, which suggests that both co-wives require chalitza. If that's true, then it would support up here lema mesaya le Rabba bar Rav Huna. Tamar Rabba bar Rav Huna chalitza pesula siricha lechazer al kol hachin. His opinion was that if you have a deficient chalitza, in other words, a chalitza after a get, which is this case, then it only works. That chalitza only works for that yavam and that yavama. But it will not work for other brothers. They will have to give their own chalitza, because this deficient chalitza will not work for the full zikah that the other brothers have. And similarly, if there's one yavam and many yavamot, as in this case, then this yavam, because he gave one deficient gate, this yavam gave a deficient gate to one of the yavamot, he has to give chalitza to all of the Yevamot. And so this seems to support him, because here we have he gave a get to one and a get to other, and nevertheless it says sirichot, that he has to give chalitza to both of them, because giving to any one is deficient and not strong enough for the other. We answer, no, this is not a support. Ma'id sirichot alma. Sirichot just means, in general, women in this situation will need, but not that they both need. It means that someone has to do yibum to one of the yevamot. In this case, really, it's only one. Sirichot is only a general plural for lots of cases that are like this. All right, now we jump to get lazo vehalatz lazo, down to the bottom one of that section. He does a get to one and chalitza to another one of the yevamot. And achar chalitza kelum. Once he does chalitza to the second one, that's it. He doesn't have to do anything else that totally breaks the zikah, and he doesn't have to go and do anything for the first one for whom he did a get. Once again, similar to what we saw above here, the Gemara is going to say maybe it seems to be purposeful, significant that it says get to one and chalitza to the other, and only then he doesn't have to do anything. But what if he gave get to one and chalitza to the same first co-wife? Then maybe that wouldn't work, and he would have to give another chalitza to the second. since it specifies it this way. So lema mesea lishmuel v'tiyevet yubtal leRav Yosef. So the same thing, the opposite, the same questions that we had before. This seems to support Shemuel and the challenge to Rav Yosef, but we answer the same thing. Mikatani choles halas katani diavad. No, it says that, it doesn't say that he's doing this. He does it on purpose, as if he only has to do it this way. Otherwise, it's not good. It says he did it. He happened to give get to one and chalitza to the other. It happened to be the case. But if he did it to the same one, then also it would be fine. And so we don't say that just because he gave a get and the chalitza to the same woman and it's deficient and there's some problem with it. No, it doesn't matter either way. Okay, halas vechalas or halas vechule velitne nami and achar bi'ah kelum. So now in this last section, we have here, it says first you do chalitza and then you do anything else. Or you do bi'ah and then you do anything else. Either way, there's nothing to do, right? The chalitza is the final, and nothing. It doesn't matter what happens after. And the bi'ah that comes first, it doesn't matter what happens after. And then it says en achad chalitza kilum. But in the summary statement, it only says there is no need to do any action after chalitza because every other action after that is invalid. It doesn't create, it doesn't break any other zikot. How come over here it doesn't say also bi'ah? Because you mentioned two cases, chalas and bi'ah. Same question as we had above. We're repeating the question here because the question comes up again, but the answer will be the same. Why do you say also after bi'ah there's no need to do anything? Yes, in fact, Rabbi said, yeah, you could put in the same words here, and it is in fact true that after bi'ah there is nothing. But our Tana chose to put only this one because better to talk about a case where she can go and marry anyone in the shuk and not have to get involved in any other problems that may arise. So chose only one. Okay, I think there is actually a different reason for why it does not say and achar bi'ah kilum, which is that this is actually going to be the subject of machlok. It's not true that in all cases, only when bi'ah is first, then there's no bi'ah, after bi'ah there's nothing. But bi'ah after chalitza, right, only when bi'ah is first, but when bi'ah is in the middle, we're going to see in a second that is the subject of a machloket. So I think that's all he wants to put here, things that are agreed to by everyone, and leave open the bi'ah situation because, yeah, in this case, bi'ah happens to be first, and that's why there's nothing after it. But in a case, here also, but in a case where bi'ah is not first, then there may very well be something after it. So I think there is, in fact, another reason besides this one. All right, ben yavam echad ishte yevamot bishlamad Rabbi Yochanan de'amar כולה ביתה בלאו כאה, יצטריך להשמינן דאין קידושין תופסין בחייבי לוי. We're now discussing this clause here at the end that says whatever we said was true for 2 Yevamot and 1 man is also true for 2 brothers and 1 Yevamah. And then we repeat one of the cases here. We say, yeah, if you did chalitza and after that you did anything else, doesn't matter. There's nothing after the chalitza, and the one just like that, not for that brother, and the other brother also does not have to do anything after chalitza. So doing ma'amar, doing kiddushin after chalitza does not work, does not do anything. Okay, now we're wondering, why do we need this clause? What is it coming to add? So we understand it would make sense that we need this clause according to Rabbi Yochanan. This is going back to machloket we had many dapim ago between Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Lakish. The machloket is, what is the status of the other brothers after one of them does chalitza? With the one that does chalitza, once he does chalitza, he is under a prohibition of asher lo yivneh. Once he decided to reject her and not build the house, so then he is never allowed to build the house again, and that's a isur lav. He cannot marry her. If he tries to marry her, that would be an isur lav with all of those consequences. Now, Rabbi Yochanan says that the other brothers who do not do the chalitza, they are messengers. They are sending the one who does chalitza as a messenger. And so it's as if they also did chalitza, and therefore their punishment, if they try to marry her, would also be a lav, and not isur eshet ach, even though it is their brother's wife, but now it's reduced because they could have done chalitza and they're sending their brother to do chalitza, they also are in isur lav. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, It says that the whole house, all the brothers are only a lav. We need to have this statement to tell us that for all of the brothers, if any of them tries to do ma'amad, this type of kiddushin, then and tofsin, it does not work. It does not create any zikah, any requirement after chalitza that one does. All of them are in Isur Lav, and even though they're only Isur Lav, nevertheless the Kiddushin does not take hold, because it's following Rabbi Akiva. So that's an important Chiddush that we need to know. In that machlok it said that it's true. When they have many brothers, and they all have a zikah to the Yevamah, and any of them could do Yibum or Chalitza. So that's true. But after one does it, then that one gets an Isur Lav when he does Chalitza of Asher Lo Yivneh. All the other brothers revert back to Eshet Ach, and that is Karet. And so according to that, do you need to tell me this extra clause that it doesn't matter if there's multiple women or multiple brothers and one woman, that even with all the multiple brothers, if one does chalitza, then the other brothers cannot do ma'amad? Do you even need to tell me that the other brothers have an isur karet? So of course the kiddushin is not going to apply in those cases. It's obvious. All right, that's a good question. Amar Shakish v'li ta'amich. The Shakish says, I'll turn the tables around on you. Even according to you, Rabbi Yochanan, Sefa dekatani Baal ve'asa ma'amar. Right, look at the next line here. That it says he did bi'ah and then he did ma'amar. So we were talking about that case also. Why would you need that case? If he does bi'ah, one of the brothers does bi'ah, then that he's married to her, all right? And so would you need to tell me that the other brother who does kiddushin, that doesn't work because it doesn't work? Do you even need to tell me that? That case is Eshet Ish, because the first one already married her, and Eshet Ish is also karet. So Sefa tekatani Baal v'asam Amar is terich lashmoinan de en kiddushin tofsin be'eshet ish. Do you need to tell me that kiddushin will not work for the second brother after the first one married her? That's Eshet Ish, and that's also karet. So you can't explain your question to me. I'll ask you from the next clause. Rather, I have an answer, and the answer solves both problems according to you and according to me, so you have no question. Rather, since it was already talking about the case of one Yavam and one Yevamah, that was the first Kesad. So then we also talk about the case of two Yevamot and Yavam Echad. And since it talked about two women and one man, so then it says let's fill in all the details, all the possibilities, and talk about two Yevamot and one Yavam, even though there actually is no chidush. There's no big new thing that we're learning from here. It's just going through the cases in a formulaic way, and therefore there's no question against me that you would have to, you're the same answer that you would say, I will say. So none of us have any problems. Good. Halas ve'asa ma'amar ve'natan. The Mishnah says if he does chalitza and then he does anything else afterwards, that's it. The chalitza is the ending thing, and there's nothing else to do after the chalitza. Does not you can't create a new zikah or break any zikah. Bishlama halas v'asa ma'amar istirich. Now I understand why I need the case of first you're doing chalitza and then ma'amar. Because it's possible you might have thought that we should make a gezerah if ma'amad after chalitza is not effective at all. Then I might come to think that even if he did ma'amad before the chalitza, it's not effective at all. Even though that's not true, because you still need to give a get if the ma'amar was before. So you may have thought that we should make such a gezerah. Kamash malan de lo gazrinan. So that's why it tells us this case, so that we know we don't make such a gezerah. Ela halas v'natan get lamali. If you're doing chalitza and then giving a get afterwards, so what's the? Why do you need to tell me that? Even if it was the other way around, you did give a get, and then the chalitza, it would be the same thing. There's no even possibility that anyone would think someone should make a gezerah. So why do you even need to tell me this? Why do you have to include that case of chalatz and then get? That's the question. And now we say, oh, we'll turn the tables. Yeah, how about the next clause? Baal ve'asa ma'amad. Baal ve'natan get. So when it talks about, the first it does bi'ah and then id ma'amad, or it does bi'ah and then get. Talked about, included both of those cases. Now, bishlama baal v'natan get istarich sakadatech mina nigzor get batar be'ila atu get dekame be'ila. So I understand why I need the case of where he gave a get after the bi'ah. I need that because I might make a gezerah if he does bi'ah and then has a get afterwards. Well, that get will undo the marriage, but it doesn't do anything for a zikah. But if I permit her to go and get married in that case of bi'ah and then get and say, okay, the everything is over, the original zikah is over. The batar well, then I may come to permit it in a case where I have a get first and then bi'ah, and I would permit her to say, oh, she can go marry anyone in the shuk. But that's not true in this case, because if you give a get first, the get does not break a zikah. And when you do bi'ah afterwards, that is an insufficient bi'ah. And then she still requires halisa to go and get married. And so I understand why you'd have to tell me this case, because it might make sense to make a gezerah that bi'ah and then get. Maybe you should still require chalitza after that, just in case people get confused, because get and then bi'ah, you do need chalitza. So I understand kamash malan de lo gazirnan. So the Mishnah comes to say that no, don't make such a gezerah. This includes that case. Aval baal ve'asa ma'amad lamali. But let's say he does bi'ah and then he does ma'amad after that. So okay, so they're married and they're just just reconnected through an extra kiddushin that doesn't actually do anything. But you don't have to tell me this case. You're never going to get confused. Let's say it was the other way around. He did ma'amad first and then bi'ah. They'd also be married in that case, fully married, and then the brothers can go, or co-wives can go and on their way. There's no more zikah for them, and there's even if you got confused, nothing bad would come from it. So why do you have to tell me that case? Right, so in other words, according to your logic, I'll ask you this question from the Sefer, and so we answer both questions by saying, Ela, I did the Tana halas v'asama amar, Tana nami baal v'asama amar, v'ai the ba'ed mitne baal v'natan get, Tana nami halas v'natan get. Rather, we're saying it's just formulaic. We're just including all the possibilities, even though you're right, there is really no chidush, there's no reason to think, since we already taught you the case of halatz and then ma'amar, in which case that is an interesting case, I need to say that. So I'll also include the other case of bi'ah and then ma'amad. And since I already talked about a case of bi'ah and then get, so I'll also fill it out where there is, you might have thought to make a gezerah. So I'll include also just to fill out all the possibilities. But really you're right, there is no chidush in that case. Okay, bisman shehi. So we'll now discuss the very last clause where we had machloket in the Gemara. We're going to see there's yet a third opinion that's not in the Mishnah. There's a third opinion that's not mentioned in the Mishnah. So the Tana Kama here said that after chalitza, there's nothing will be effective. But after bi'ah, it depends. If the bi'ah is first, then nothing after will be effective. But if the bi'ah is in second or third position, then something after may be effective. Rabbi Nechemia was more lenient, and he said, no, bi'ah, no matter which order it is, or chalitza, no matter where it is, nothing after it will be valid. We'll see another opinion that is more stringent than both of these, and say for both of them, chalitza and bi'ah have to be first in order for anything after to be invalid. So matintin deloki haitana, our Mishnah does not include the following opinion. The Tanya, Abba Yosef ben Yochanan ish Yerushalayim omer mishum Rabbi Meir. Achat be'ila ve'achat chalitza betechila en acharei hakelum. Ba'emsa ubasof yesh acharei hakelum. Since bi'ah and chalitza are the same, that if they are first, then nothing after them will affect the zikah. But if they're in the middle or the end, chalitza also, then something after it may very well be effective. Okay, v'shalosh machalokot b'davar. To sum up the matter, there are in fact three opinions about it. Tanakama savar, bi'ah di'ika lemigzar gazrinan. Halisadek deleka lemigzar lo gazrinan. Tanakama has a good logic, makes logical sense. He says, regarding bi'ah, it depends where it is, because there is good reason to make a gezerah if bi'ah is in second place. If bi'ah comes after a get, and if he gives a get to one, Yavam gives a get to one woman, and then bi'ah to the second. If we say, so really technically that get was nothing on the Doraita level. So if we say that bi'ah, there's a marriage, and then because he married the second one, so the first one can go free. If we allow that, then we might confuse get with chalitza. And we may think that, if one does chalitza to one woman, then he can still do bi'ah to the second one, because look, in the case of get, he did that. So when bi'ah is second, that's confusing. It's all confusing, also confusing if bi'ah is second after ma'amar, because if he does ma'amar to one, so he's engaged to one, and then he does bi'ah to the second, so really that ma'amar was not anything, and that bi'ah will make a full marriage, and that full marriage will undo the ma'amar that was there before. Yes, but ma'amad is very similar to kiddushin, which actually affects is a real marriage. And therefore, people may confuse the ma'amad with the bi'ah and say, if the yavam does bi'ah to one, he can still do bi'ah to the second one, just like he did ma'amad to one and bi'ah to the second one. And obviously, in that case, it's not true. Once he does bi'ah to the first, then that's fully married, and the other one would be prohibited. So therefore, in the case of bi'ah, it does make sense to make a gezerah, because if you put it second, it could lead to confusion. If it's first, then it's clear. Now, chalitza, however, there's no reason to make a gezerah, even if chalitza is second. So what? So he did ma'amad with one woman, and then he did chalitza with the second. You're going to confuse that with bi'ah to the first and chalitza to the second? Fine, so do that. Do bi'ah to the first and chalitza to the second. Do chalitza with everybody who you want in the world 100 times. Doesn't matter that chalitza has no effect, and there's no prohibition in doing chalitza after doing something else. And so therefore, there's no need to make a gezerah. So that's the opinion of Tanakama. Rabbi Nechemia says, why making a gezerah for bi'ah? What are you going to come to think? It's not confusing. Okay, you claim that we should make a gezerah for bi'ah that comes after a get, because that looks like bi'ah after chalitza. If you do chalitza to one, then certainly you can't do bi'ah to the other, and people will get confused. No. People know basic things in the Torah. Okay, they don't know maybe some subtle detail of a baraita somewhere. But if it's an explicit pasuk, everybody knows that. In the case of Yibum, you have chalitza. And that's different from a marriage where you have get. Everybody can make this distinction. It's pretty simple. In fact, you're just making it even more complicated by confusing the two categories. And so there's no need to make a gezerah. And you also thought you should make a gezerah when bi'ah is second after ma'amar, because people will get confused between the ma'amar and bi'ah, and thinks if you could do it after bi'ah, you could also after ma'amar, then you could also, he can have bi'ah with one and then bi'ah for the second, because remember the other case, that guy did ma'amar to one and bi'ah to the second. No, also here, kevan de bi'ah doraita ha medaya da'eh. Everybody knows that the law of Yibum knows what it is, and they'll know the difference between a ma'amar and a bi'ah. If someone just does this kiddushin with the woman, that's not a real kiddushin. It doesn't create eshet ish. It's only a designation midrabanan. So everybody will know that that's different from bi'ah. That is Yibum. And that he's going to be fully married after the first bi'ah. No one's going to come to do it for a second one. So that's why Rabbi Nechemia says, I could be lenient on this and bi'ah in any spot, or a chalitza in any order is not going to lead to confusion, and is the last straw. Anything after that is not relevant. Rabbi Yosef ben Chanan sabala k'Rabbanan degazre bi'ah ve'gazar chalisa mishum bi'ah. So Rabbi Yosef, he agrees with Rabbanan that bi'ah is confusing. People will confuse it in other cases, and once you're making gezerah with bi'ah, also add in a gezerah for chalitza, because if you say, chalitza when it's in second position is okay, then people are going to get confused. I guess when bi'ah is in the second order, then also it's okay, because they're going to just put them all together, and so therefore part of the gezerah, while you're at it, may as well make a gezerah for that case as well. But this opinion is not even included in the Mishnah. This is a kind of an interesting case, because that opinion was Rabbi Meir, and even though we say often that usually Rabbi Meir is the Tanakh Kama, in this case Rabbi Yehuda Nasi chose not to include Rabbi Meir at all. but rather only the other two opinions of the Tanakh Kama, whoever that is, and Rabbi Nechemiah, Hadran Alach, Rabban Gamaliel. Baruch Adonai Olam, Amen v'Amen.